All right, so I'm doing the next question that we did in this webinar with Trainalyzed. So I have the slide up from the Trainalyzed webinar. Again, it's in German, but I will do the translation. So the question was MOXIE and altitude, altitude training, effects of altitude, and so on. And so I've done a little bit of this. And I'm going to refer to two specific studies to reflect also my own experiences. And so the first one is by Willis, and they actually did simulated hypoxia, and they tried to simulate different heights, different altitudes, so 300, so base sea level, 300 meters, and then 2,000 meters, and close to 4,000 meters above sea level. And what they find is generally what I've seen, and I've done most of my measurements at altitude measurements, between 2,500 and 3,500 meters. And they see essentially that your NIRS values are depressed. So your muscle oxygenation values are lower than they would be at sea level. Now, this makes sense because you measure SpO2, so you measure arterial oxygen saturation. Those are also lower. And those actually relate to, those are pretty similar changes, which I see. If your arterial saturation is now at 91%, so that's 5, 6, 7, 8% lower than at sea level, you have that type of gap in your SMO2 data as well. There's likely this direct relationship between the ability to saturate your arterial blood or lack thereof because of the altitude and the loss of atmospheric pressure, and what you're then getting to your muscle. This makes a lot of sense that there's that relationship there. Now, however, what's interesting is this other study by Martin and colleagues, and they did the same thing. So they did sea level measurements, and then they do the 3,500 meters, which is pretty similar to the Willis one, and then they do over 5,000 meters. And if you look at their data, they show similar trends to Willis and to what I've experienced at the over 3,000 meters, where you have this decrease in muscle oxygenation. But when they do their first test at over 5,000 meters, they actually have an opposite response, which is really interesting. All of a sudden, their maximal desaturation is actually higher, so that they can't desaturate as well as before, which is a reversal from the initial increase in altitude, which is interesting. And it becomes even more interesting is when they repeat these tests at over 5,000 meters after an adaptation phase, it returns back to similar results to the 3,000 meters. So there's some adaptation phase there that allows you to, again, desaturate. And what's interesting is that this counter response doesn't happen at altitude at 3,500 meters, but it happens at altitude above 5,000 meters. So at, let's say, extreme altitude, which is an interesting phenomenon. Now, I'm going to give a quick reasoning to why I think this might be happening. Somewhat speculative, but it does have to do with Timothy Noakes' central governor, or at least a concept of a central governor. If you agree with Noakes or not, it's he does present data on reduced cardiac output at altitude, for example, and attributes this to a central governor, because there's obviously more capacity for cardiac output as shown, but it's reduced at altitude. This might all tie into this some kind of protective mechanism where central systems are protected at altitude because they're under higher stress. In order to do this, you need to somehow reduce peripheral muscle activity, or either you have to reduce it or it will be reduced somehow, which is then this debate around peripheral or central limitations. The fact is that there is a peripheral response at this high altitude seen through muscle oxygenation, and you're unable to desaturate, likely a result of the performance goes down, so your muscles are being activated to a lesser degree as well. And this all ties in together, but somehow an adaptation phase then attenuates this this limitation, which is again also seen by NOACs with cardiac output and adaptation in altitude. So I do think this fits nicely into a central governor type model of peripheral and central limitations. So they're definitely nice studies, and it shows at least a certain degree of effectiveness of using muscle oxygenation to track at least changes in muscular performance at altitude, and therefore help in training guidance as you change through altitude and try to gauge the effect that this altitude is having on your physiological system. I think NIRS can be very valuable to do that. Whereas something like power is not very useful, because 300 watts is 300 watts, but your physiology to create 300 watts is completely been turned around at altitude. So you need to be careful when using zones based on watts if you're changing altitude. I think this is also true if you're going to hotter climates, things like that. But this is where these physiological measures become very important, and why you can't just use a power measure. Because a power measure doesn't really care at what altitude you're at. Okay, I hope that's useful. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.